Ahlan biku. Today's lecture is about, we will continue our talk about the cranial cavity and the brain. So let's start. The upper end of the neural tube during early development in the embryo uh, gets differentiated into three major swellings. See, one, two, three. The rostral one, the most rostral one, the top one, is called the prosencephalon. Prosencephalon is the anterior brain or the forebrain, and it consists of the telencephalon that will give rise to the cerebral hemispheres. You must know this, the origins of each, and the diencephalon. The diencephalon is the thalamus. So the prosencephalon will give you the telencephalon, the cerebral hemispheres, and the diencephalon, which is the thalamus. The middle swelling is called the mesencephalon, which is the middle brain or midbrain. It will develop into the known midbrain of the brainstem. The rhombencephalon is the back brain, the posterior brain or the hind brain. It will give rise to the metencephalon and myelencephalon. Now, the myelencephalon is the medulla oblongata, but the metencephalon is the pons and the cerebellum. The pons actually it belongs to the cerebellum. It's a bridge between the two cerebellar hemispheres. So the rhombencephalon, the hind brain, will give rise to the metencephalon, which is the cerebellum and pons, and the myelencephalon, which is the medulla oblongata, and then the spinal cord. The spinal cord is called the spinal medulla, by the way. It's continuation of the medulla oblongata. Okay, this is about a hint about embryology to be oriented with the terms. Now, the CNS is composed of gray matter and white matter. The gray matter and white matter actually are one. The gray matter is the cell bodies of neurons with the dendrites connecting them, and the white matter is the axons of these cells. So you cannot separate both from each other because they are one entity, a neuron. Okay, and collection of axons, bunch of axons makes a fascicle and so forth, and altogether they form the white matter. Now the gray matter is on the outer side, on the surface, as the cortex. This is the cortex of the cerebral hemisphere. See, it's thrown into gyri. The gyri are the elevations, and sulci are the depressions between the gyri and sulci. See, and there's a major fissure separating the two cerebral hemispheres. This is the interhemispheric fissure. Now, mostly thrown outside in the form of cortex, but you can find, actually you do find, collections of gray matter in the midst of the white matter. Like, for example, the basal ganglia, the lentiform nucleus. This is the lentiform nucleus with its putamen and globus pallidus parts. This is the caudate nucleus. See the caudate nucleus. This is the beginning of the head of the caudate nucleus. It's one of the basal ganglia. Okay, mammillary bodies, for example. So you will find collections of neurons in the midst of the white matter. This is the location of the gray matter. Okay, so we will name to describe the brain. You will divide the brain into hemispheres and divide each hemispheres into areas or lobes and name each gyrus according to its function, for example. Okay, let's proceed. Okay, this is the superolateral surface of the left cerebral hemisphere. Now, don't be surprised, but you might get confused without the cerebellum. Where's the front and where's the back of the hemisphere? Don't be surprised, but stress makes you get confused sometimes in practical exams. The frontal pole is much larger than the pointed occipital pole. See? The occipital pole is in the back and the frontal pole at the front. It's much broader and wider than the occipital pole. And you see this lobe, the temporal lobe, always points anterior. So this is anterior and this is posterior for the cerebral hemisphere, and the location of the cerebellum will be here below the occipital area of the cerebral hemisphere. Okay, so now you know the frontal pole and the occipital pole. This is different than lobes. Let's subdivide the hemisphere. I want you to look, see, all these are sulci, and the gyri. Gyri are, not continuous, interrupted gyri. But I want you to look for a sulcus, that the only sulcus that has a complete gyrus in front of it and behind it. See, I think this area is being revealed now. This area. See this sulcus, the only one that has a complete gyrus in front and at the back. This is called the central sulcus. See, it doesn't have to be central, maybe posterior a little bit or anterior a little bit, but it demarks the frontal lobe in front from the parietal lobe at the back. These are multiple choice questions. The central sulcus separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe of the hemisphere. See that? Okay, now there's another sulcus here, the big one. Actually, it's a fissure. The lateral sulcus separates the frontal, parietal from the temporal lobe. So you must interpret what you see into words to answer questions. The lateral sulcus or lateral fissure of Sylvius separates the parietal and frontal from the temporal lobe. You see that? There is no demarcation for the occipital area on the superolateral surface, but there is from the medial surface, the parieto-occipital sulcus, I mean. There is the end of the parieto-occipital sulcus, so below this and behind this is the occipital lobe, and above this is the parietal lobe, okay? And at front you'll find the temporal lobe. Now you divided the hemisphere into major lobes, frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. Let's subdivide each lobe into specific gyri related to common functions and shapes as well. See the first gyrus in the frontal lobe, this one, it's in front of the central sulcus. It's called the precentral gyrus. Or if you're talking physiology, this is primary motor area 4. This is the area that sends commands for the motor functions of the body. And the body is represented, the representation of the body, by the way, on a certain area of the cortex is called somatotopic representation. And the somatotopic representation of the body, with the head at the lower end of the gyrus, and then the neck, body, and the lower limbs, from the legs or the half legs downwards on the medial side. See, the body is inverted upside down. The same thing on the sensory gyrus. This one, it's called the postcentral gyrus, or if you're talking physiology, it's area 312. Primary sensations. All the sensations from the body are represented here in a somatotopic representation, where the body is inverted upside down, and the limbs on the medial surface of the hemisphere. Okay, so we have a pre-central gyrus belongs to the frontal lobe, and post-central gyrus belongs to the parietal lobe. Now, what else in the frontal lobe? You see that? This is a superior frontal gyrus, interrupted gyrus. This is a middle frontal gyrus, and this is an inferior frontal gyrus. Okay? 1, 2, 3, like arches. The front ones in the areas that determine behavior and personality, okay, and problem thinking. The inferior frontal gyrus, for example, on the left side is the association area for the primary. All the primary areas have association areas. Association for the head, and particularly the mouth, the pharynx and larynx, tongue, means this is a speech center here. Some diagrams of the cerebral hemisphere, you'll find numbers on them. Like, for example, this area is called area 44-45, the speech area. The numbers indicate the number of the slide the specimen was on, so that's has no other significance. Like the area 3, 1, 2, area 4. These are the numbers designated for the slides that had the specimen from this particular area. Okay? This is called, for example, the Broca's area. We will not, of course, study the functions of the cerebral hemisphere, but I am giving you an example of an associative area on the inferior frontal gyrus on the left side. In females, by the way, it's developed on the right side as well. This is not a joke, but this is a fact. They have both Broca's areas on both hemispheres, and if children of small age got injured, the same injury in the head, one male and one female, the male might lose the ability to talk, but the female develops it in spite of the injury, because there is a spare area on the right side, the Broca's area. This is an example. So they are not identical, actually, the two cerebral hemispheres. Okay, what else? We have the post-central gyrus. I said that this is for the primary sensation. And don't forget, the floor of the sulcus also belongs to the gyri, so there are areas as well at the sides of the sulcus. And posterior to the post-central gyrus, we have the association parietal area. Consists of the supramarginal lobule at the tip of the lateral sulcus, the angular lobule at the tip of the superior temporal sulcus. See, this is the superior temporal sulcus. This is the superior temporal gyrus. Now, on the superior temporal gyrus, there is the hearing area, and to the inside, goes to the inside for hearing, for example. This is the middle temporal gyrus and inferior temporal gyrus. Middle involved in hearing as well, and the middle and inferior are for the memory. If you dig in the inferior and go inside the temporal lobe, you will find the hippocampal formation, part of the limbic system and involved in memory. You will see it in the floor of the lateral ventricle, inferior horn. Okay, this is what you can study in anatomy about the external features of the superolateral side of the cerebral hemisphere. Now, this is called the preoccipital notch. A line between the preoccipital notch and the tip of parieto-occipital sulcus demarcates the occipital lobe from the rest of the brain, from the superolateral aspect. Okay, this is a sagittal section of the cerebral hemisphere. We're looking at the medial side of this cerebral hemisphere. This is front, and this is back because of the pointed pole, occipital pole, as well as the presence of the cerebellum. Of course, it's in the back, and the one that occupies the posterior cranial fossa. Okay, observe the cut section of the mid part of the cerebellum called the vermis. See, and observe the cut section, sagittal section of the brainstem. This is the medulla oblongata. This is the closed part, the one that is not involved in the fourth ventricle yet. And this part is the upper part, or the open part, which is part gradually opens into the fourth ventricle. This is called the open medulla, and this is closed medulla. If you can see that in sections, different sections in the medulla oblongata. Now the pons is the bridge between the two cerebellar hemispheres. You can see here the base is pontus and tegmentum pontus. Tegmentum pontus all belong to the pons, which is actually the a bridge of that belongs to the cerebellar hemispheres. Okay, and high up in the brainstem you see the midbrain with its tegmentum, continuous with the tegmentum pontus, this one, and tectum, which has 4 colliculi, 2 on each side, superior and inferior colliculi. Together they are called the corpora quadrigemina, the four bodies. Okay, and remember the aqueduct of Sylvius we talked about earlier, that leads to the fourth ventricle and connects to the third ventricle, which is the cavity you see here between this thalamus and hypothalamus with the other thalamus and hypothalamus. I am in the cavity of the third ventricle now. See that? Now projects posteriorly from the roof of the third ventricle, connected to the thalamus, is the pineal gland. This is the pineal gland. And hanging from the floor of the hypothalamus, a pituitary stalk that connects to the physically to the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, the neurohypophysis. This is called the adenohypophysis, the anterior part of the pituitary, and the posterior part of pituitary is called the neurohypophysis, connected by a pituitary stalk through the diaphragma cilia we talked about to the hypothalamus above. See that? And this is a cut section of the crossing of the optic nerves, which is called the optic chiasm. Optic chiasm. See that? Okay. Now this is the continuation of the cortex we saw on the superolateral surface. This is called the medial frontal gyrus. This is called the cingulate gyrus. Cingulum means a belt. It runs around this structure, which is the corpus callosum, a bunch of white matter, and the fornix, another white matter collection, and the anterior commissure, another white matter collection. This encircles them. It's called the cingulate gyrus, and has the cingulate sulcus and the callosal sulcus beneath it. Why am I saying this? These terms? Because we will use them when talking about the branches of the anterior cerebral, for example. Anterior cerebral artery. It has a pericallosal branch and callosomarginal branch, for examples. Okay, running in these sulci. So we have to know about them. Now, surrounding the tip of the central sulcus, we said the central sulcus has the pre-central gyrus in front and post-central gyrus at the back. Continuation of them on the medial surface is called the paracentral lobule. These are the areas we talked about for the legs, for the lower part of the lower limbs on this side. Okay? So if, for example, there is a tumor in the middle, in the falx cerebri, for example, a neurofibroma that will make or exert pressure on this side and the opposite side, the patient will come complaining of weakness and paralysis of the lower limbs, right? So yeah, you think about, you must know the areas in order to isolate the site of the injury you are examining. Okay, at the back you have the parieto-occipital sulcus, this one, and the calcarine sulcus. It has two parts, calcarine and post-calcarine sulcus. Now, between the parieto-occipital and the calcarine, actually area called the cuneus, and this is the lingular gyrus, and both belong to the occipital lobe, where the retina will be represented here. Center of retina at the back, very back, and then as you go forward, you will go to the periphery of the retina of the eye. This is the visual area. Primary visual area 17, and two association areas 18 and 19. You will study this in vision. Okay? Since this is the cuneus, so this is the precuneus, connects to the association parietal cortex on the lateral side. Okay, so these are the features of the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. Yes, I know many terms, many names, but you will get used to it and try to understand the functions and relations of each part to the other. Okay, this is the inferior surface of the cerebral hemispheres. This is the temporal pole, the pole of the temporal lobe. This gyrus, the most medial one, is called the hippocampal gyrus, and its tip is called the uncus. If you dig here, you will get into the inferior horn of the lateral ventricle of the lateral ventricle of the brain, and the hippocampal formation. That's why it's called the hippocampal gyrus, and this is called the parahippocampal gyrus, and medial and lateral occipitotemporal gyri. Okay, they are all related to association areas and memory and the limbic system. Okay, and the front parts involved in olfaction as well. See, these are the inferior surface of the frontal lobe, called orbital gyri and sulci, with a straight one, the most medial, it's called the gyrus rectus. Lateral to the gyrus rectus, you have a sulcus called the olfactory sulcus, because it has the olfactory bulb and tract in it. See, this is the olfactory tract, dividing into medial and lateral stria later. This is the olfactory sulcus for the olfactory tract. Now, this is the optic chiasma and the optic tracts, and this is a cut section of the midbrain and the mammillary bodies of the hypothalamus. Okay. Now, this is the cut section of the cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius. You don't have to know this now, the substantia nigra and red nucleus. This you'll study in neurophysiology. Okay, so this is the inferior part of the cerebral hemisphere. It's easy as the other two views. You shouldn't find any problem in these. Okay. Now, we talked about the gray matter and how it's been distributed. The white matter now. The white matter takes three forms. Association fibers, or commissural fibers, or projection fibers. Association fibers means they connect parts of the same hemisphere, like two adjacent gyri, for example, by short arcuate fibers, see? Or fascicles, long fascicles, like the superior longitudinal fasciculus and inferior longitudinal fasciculus. Another fasciculus called the arcuate fasciculus. See, but they connect parts of the same hemisphere. Remember this. These are classified as association fibers. Those who connect parts, adjacent parts in both hemispheres, means they cross the midline, called the commissural fibers. And of course, the most apparent one example of all is the corpus callosum. This is the corpus callosum that has a body and splenium, head and rostrum parts. These are commissural fibers between the different parts of the brain of the cerebral hemisphere, all parts now collecting in this bundle and going to the other side to connect to the corresponding parts on the other cerebral hemisphere. The same principle is for the fornix. This is one of the commissural fibers. The anterior commissure. We have also a posterior commissure. We have a habenular commissure. If you are specialized in neuroanatomy, you will study those. Now remember that extending between the fornix and the corpus callosum is the septum pellucidum, that separates the lateral ventricle of this side from the lateral ventricle of the side I'm at now, and connected through the interventricular foramen of Monroe below the fornix. Remember this, please. Interventricular foramen of Monroe connects both lateral ventricles. We talked about this. And both ventricles to the cavity of the third ventricle. See, these are the lateral ventricles. This is the septum pellucidum and the fornix. This is the cavity of the third ventricle and the foramen beneath the fornix. Now this cut section, this is a coronal section of the brain and cerebellum and brainstem, to show you example of projection fibers. Projection fibers means fibers that project to or from the cortex, to the cortex or from the cortex. Okay. The famous example for projection fibers is the internal capsule. This is called the internal capsule. This is the internal, contains fibers descending from the cortex through the brainstem, decussate and medulla oblongata, and to the other side of the body. This is the famous corticospinal tract and has the same organization for corticobulbar tract that relays on the cranial nerve nuclei. Okay, projection fibers to or from the cerebral cortex. So these are the forms of the white matter you will encounter, either association fibers, either commissural fibers, or projection fibers. Okay, a good info to remember. Okay, what else? At last we have to talk a little about the ventricular system. We mentioned that there are two lateral ventricles. Each ventricle has anterior horn, body, posterior horn, and inferior horn in the temporal lobe. Anterior horn, body, posterior horn, and inferior horn in the temporal lobe. Of course, the posterior horn is in the occipital lobe. This is a horizontal section, horizontal deep section, with this one deeper than this one. This is to show you, see, part of the body and posterior horn of the lateral ventricle. This is the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle. They are not continuous because the ventricle is arched superiorly. So when you take a horizontal section, there will be a front part and a back part. Oriented now? Got it? This is the floor of the anterior horn of the lateral ventricle. It has the caudate nucleus and the thalamus in it. See that? Okay. And this is the body and posterior horns in the occipital lobe, related to the visual areas on the cortex. Now the inferior horn, see that? We are inside the inferior horn at this level. You can see this lion's foot like structure. It's called the hippocampal formation. That is a major component of the limbic system. We have in the middle the limbic system, the system involved in instincts and emotions and motivations. Okay, this is the hippocampal formation. It's also concerned with short-term memory. Now, from the lateral ventricles through the interventricular foramen of Monroe, you will find the cavity of the third ventricle. That part of it is between the two thalami, interrupted by the interthalamic adhesions you can see here. There is a couple of nuclei in this area, and the hypothalamus C. And the third ventricle has recesses, like a recess, this tiny recess in the root of the pineal gland. It's called pineal recess. And this is infundibular recess, you know, at the beginning of the pituitary stalk to the pituitary gland. Okay, and don't forget that related to the third ventricle in the floor is the optic chiasm. Optic chiasm. This is the third ventricle. And from the third ventricle, through the cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius that separates the tectum from the tegmentum of the midbrain, to the fourth ventricle that lies, roofed by the cerebellum and floored by the back of the pons and open medulla. This is the fourth ventricle, and as we mentioned before, there is a central opening to the central canal of the spinal cord. It's called the foramen of Magendie, and two lateral foramina to the outside of this subarachnoid space around the spinal cord and around, continuous with the one around the brain, which are called the foramina of Luschka and Magendie, to spread the CSF that surrounds the brain and the spinal cord. And we talked about how the brain is floating in the CSF to reduce its weight and to maintain its shape and function, of course. Well, I know there is a lot to study, but I'm only concerned about if you have a big idea now about what's happening in the cerebral hemispheres and the brainstem. This is the important issue, and learning things by heart comes with practice, so don't worry. And I wish you all the best. Thank you very much for watching.